So, folks, welcome back. My name is Adam Beck. I'm the CEO of the Connected Technology Alliance, and with me I have Anthony Barnes, CEO of Viden. Anthony, how is life? Are you well?
Yeah, good, good. We're super excited for the upcoming scheme, and I think there's lots of things in the cybersecurity ecosystem that are quite topical at the moment, and I think the scheme will certainly be one of those things in the coming few months.
Yeah, look, there's no standing still, and it's always moving quickly, which is both exciting, technically challenging, which we all like a good challenge. But Anthony, so so Viden runs. You've got an accredited testing lab for cyber physical systems. This is exactly what, smart devices are and what they involve, hardware and software working together. The labeling scheme, which sort of you mentioned there, for smart devices, that's about to move into a pilot phase, as we know. I'd like to know from you, what does a label actually need to be backed by to mean something? And, how does that compare with like traditional paper-based compliance systems, when it comes to device testing? So what does that label actually need to be backed by, do you think, to actually mean something?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think first and foremost, I think to have any sort of consumer credibility, I think it's going to be integral that the labeling scheme is able to demonstrate that it is applying a pretty rigorous testing process to all devices. That testing process does have an element of impartiality associated with it, in that it's using accredited and independent laboratories to certainly evaluate some of those products, and that there's enough and appropriate checks and balances in the scheme so that the scheme operator is ultimately also conducting their own sort of independent checks of the evidence that's put forward by either the OEMs or the laboratories themselves. I think in terms of the difference between a lot of the paper-based schemes that we sometimes see out there, as opposed to like really more in-depth physical systems testing like we do in the laboratories here, I think lots of people out there, and certainly in some of the other audits that we do and see, plenty of companies might have really, really good or well-written policies, but where the rubber really hits the road in a lot of those is how these actually being implemented. And it's testing the implementation of well-intentioned and even well-written policies that's really the important bit. And I think that's what the scheme's going to bring to the forefront. It'll be it's not just a document check activity. It will be a very independent and rigorous testing of the devices themselves to say, despite what people might say on paper, has the device actually met the security requirements that have been set under the standard? And I think, that should give consumers a lot of confidence that, the devices aren't just lip service or, a paper-based activity. It's a real tangible testing of those devices.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, often a lot of the security, connected technology security talk is often about software, and as we know, in your line of work, hardware assurance is a key part of that. Anthony, what comes to mind for me is when we've got the bulk of, I'm going to use the word bulk, but the bulk of smart devices being built offshore. What are those hardware level risks that organizations potentially face? And today, kind of how worried should they be? Can you shine some light on that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think, software flaws certainly get a lot of attention in the media, and they're a really obvious and easy thing for people to wrap their heads around. But the supply chain risks associated with, manufacturing supply chains in today's day and age uh, equally present some pretty significant risks as well. I think counterfeit electronics are certainly something that's creeping into more and more devices. Substitute electronics, where more legitimate parts have been substituted by other substandard or less quality parts. And also, we're seeing a prevalence of undocumented functionality or access interfaces being built into devices and technologies as well. And sometimes that's very, very well intentioned by the OEMs. They're collecting telemetry data and other things like that. There's nothing nefarious particularly about it, but they're sort of undocumented interfaces that nonetheless, pose security risks to some of these technologies that people are ingesting into their everyday lives or sometimes into their corporate environments. So I think, yep, software does get a lot of attention, but there's still a number of risks associated with supply chains. And in a globally connected environment that we're in at the moment, and will no doubt acceleratedly be, that's always going to be another consideration as well. And I think part of the benefit of the scheme is that it is going to apply some pretty rigorous oversight to some degree of the devices to make sure that they have been manufactured at a hardware level, not just a software level, to reduce some of those security risks.
And I suppose my last question, Anthony, and what you're referring to, and if I sort of step back a little bit and think more broadly around this, is that, this idea of trust is really starting to creep into all parts of our lives and how important it is when we don't have it. In this sector, I suppose trust often means sort of, reputation, brand promise. Um, you know, your work and what Viden do is really around helping turning trust into something that's, tangible and testable. You put devices on benches and, produce evidence of that. How do you see the relationship between those two things? Can anyone reasonably call a connected product trustworthy without the testing to sort of prove it and show for it? How would you respond to that?
I think there's definitely vendors out there that have built a very high degree or a level of trust with their consumers over a very, very long period of time, that they have got secure by design principles in place and they build really reliable, rugged, and resilient sort of technologies. So there's no doubt that there are some vendors in the market that have some great reputations, and do build great and secure products independent of any testing that laboratories like us might do. I think there is definitely still a place for independent testing, though. We see a lot of clients really lean into the independent testing for a couple of reasons. One, it provides a real fresh set of eyes over the problem, and often we might be able to identify things that from a fresh perspective that they may have overlooked in their design or their own testing processes. So that's probably one thing. I'd say that a lot of the vendors really lean into that process well, though, because they see that as a really good check and balance for them. And any time that we have, on the occasions that we have found flaws in different technologies, we've seen the vendors really act quite, positively to that and lean into, finding fixes to those particular flaws or vulnerabilities that may have been identified. So I think that's always been positive for us. I think the second positive is that a lot of vendors see, or OEMs see, that independent testing has been a great sort of tick of approval and really, really good from a marketing perspective. They're able to hold up those sort of independent testing certificates to say, hey, we've had our technologies pushed and pulled apart, and it's got a clean bill of health. And in a competitive environment where companies are competing for tenders to deploy new technologies out or for market share, I think that independent testing gives them a real competitive advantage to sort of show that their product is just that little bit better than some of their competitors out there. And so we see increasingly a number of companies leaning into that to gain a bit of competitive advantage, both domestically and also in some of the international markets where they might sell these products.
Absolutely. Well, look, Anthony, it seems like a busy day there at the lab, so I'll let you go. Thanks so much for joining us and look forward to catching up soon. Thank you.
No, thanks very much, Adam. Really appreciate being on today, and looking forward to catching up at the conference.
Absolutely.